All right, so a bit of a different environment, but here we go. Because it's that time. Just like every other photography related YouTuber, it's my turn to make the video explaining the very basics of photography. Because, well, like with everyone else, my ego is big enough to think that I can do it better than the other ones. So, let's get into it. So starting out with photography, it is completely okay to stick with the auto setting on your camera because you're still getting to grips with actually holding a camera and making a composition or, just engaging in the act of pulling out the camera and shooting. But just like riding a bike, there comes a time when it's time to take those training wheels off and switch the camera to manual so you can actually start learning how to make the photo or the image look the way that you want it to look. Now, the main thing you need to learn about photography is how your image is being lit. And I don't mean your lighting, I mean your exposure. So the exposure of the image. And your exposure is determined by three things: your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. And usually those three things are formed into a triangle, and that creates the term exposure triangle. Now, if you've heard that before and you didn't understand it then, let's see if we can change that. First, let's talk about shutter speed. Your camera takes an image by opening the shutter in front of the sensor, letting light hit that sensor, and then closing the shutter again. How long that shutter is open and how long that light is allowed to come into that sensor is your shutter speed. This is usually measured in parts of a second. So a fast shutter speed could be something like 1/600, or even faster, maybe over to 1/1000th of a second. Or a slow shutter speed would be something like 1 second or 20 seconds or 30 seconds for a long exposure or astrophotography. And how this affects your exposure is pretty straightforward. So the longer you allow light to hit the sensor, the more illuminated the photo itself will be. So the brighter it will be. But there is another thing that shutter speed affects, and that is motion. So with a fast shutter speed, the less time the light is allowed to hit your sensor, the less change will be depicted in that image. So with a fast shutter speed, all of the motion in that image is frozen because only a 1/600th of a second was allowed to hit that sensor. You might be fast in your movements, but you ain't that fast. But in contrast to that, a slow shutter speed will blur motion. So when you see those images with long streaks of light, that is usually shot with a slow shutter speed. But when you see an image with a bird in flight, completely sharp and completely frozen, that is shot with a fast shutter speed. Moving on from shutter speed to aperture. And what aperture is how wide the opening is in your lens for light to come in. This is usually measured in f-stops, but I'll get into that one in a second. Before that, how aperture affects your image is the wider the opening is, the more light is allowed to come in, so the image will be brighter. But the other effect that it has is the more wide open that aperture is, the more shallow your plane of focus is. This can get a bit confusing, so let me explain it further. Here you can see an image with a shallow depth of field or shallow plane of focus. You can see that only a small portion is in focus and the subject is in focus, but everything behind the subject is not. That is because the plane of focus is smaller, so it's only affecting the subject. Now here's the same image with a bigger plane of focus or a higher f-stop. So this is at f8 compared to f2.8 before this. You can see that not only is the subject in focus, but everything in the background is more in focus now as well. So as you might have connected the dots, as the f number got larger, the plane of focus got larger. And this is probably the best way you want to think about aperture. Even though a bigger aperture means that the hole is actually smaller, don't just ignore that fact at the beginning and just make the correlation between the size of the plane of focus and the size of the number, or the f-stop. So if you want a more shallow plane of focus and you want that blurry background, you want a smaller f-stop, so a smaller f number. Now the last piece of the puzzle is ISO. And what ISO pretty much is just digital gain. Increasing your ISO means increasing your sensor sensitivity to light in general. So increasing your ISO will get you a brighter image, but this has a significant drawback. As you go higher with your ISO value and you increase that sensitivity to light, you will also start to introduce noise in the image. And you've probably seen this before with those little specks in darker areas. Something black isn't exactly black, it's black with grain. And this is different from film grain, even though it looks somewhat similar. But you generally don't want that in your images. So increasing your ISO once again gets you a brighter image, but it's also going to introduce grain if you go too high. How high you can go depends on your camera itself. So as you can see, how you build your exposure for every image differs on how you want to achieve that. It's a give and take with everything, especially when you start going into low light situations where you need to slow down that shutter speed, increase that aperture, and increase that ISO. So in low light, you have much less flexibility on what you can do with the image itself. So by learning all three of these different things, you will be on your way to learning how you can nail your exposure every single time. But it takes a lot of practice, so the best way to learn is to practice and make mistakes. So that is the exposure triangle itself. Now I don't want to make an hour-long video. That would be a course, not a YouTube video. So I'm just going to quickly touch on two other things that are very much connected. Since an important part of photography and learning how to get the look that you want, you need to know your camera. And something important in that area is focal length and sensor types. So focal length is pretty simple. The larger your focal length is, the more zoomed in you will be. But not only that, the more zoomed in you are, the more compressed everything in the image starts to become. So things will look closer to each other than they really are. Or when you go wider, things might look further from each other than they really are. Also in the extreme ends, like really wide or really zoomed in, you start to introduce distortion. So that is why there are just general focal lengths like 85 millimeters for portraits, for example, because that is the focal length where the distortion is at a minimum. But before you take that 85 and you imprint that in your head, you need to learn how different sensor types affect your focal length requirements. Because there are three different types of sensors. You have full frame, APS-C or crop sensor, and micro four thirds. So full frame is the standard 35 millimeter sensor. Why I say standard is because it is the most prevalent sensor size in all high-end, even mid-end cameras. And it is the sensor size that everything else is compared to. But then there's APS-C or crop sensor cameras. The crop factor in these cameras differs by, well, the camera maker. Well, I say that, but what I really mean is Canon has a crop factor and everyone else has another one. So with Canon, the crop factor of the sensor is 1.6 times, and with Nikon, Sony, and Pentax, it is 1.5 times. That means, for example, if you have a Sony full frame camera and a Sony APS-C camera, if you want to get the same composition, you will need to take the focal length that you had on your full frame camera and divide it by the crop factor, which would be 1.5. So if you took a photo with a Sony full frame camera at 24 millimeters, then to get the same composition on the crop sensor camera, you would need to take that 24 and divide it by 1.5, which would give you 16. So you would need a 16 millimeter focal length lens on the crop sensor camera to get the same composition as you had with the 24 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. Still with me? Okay, Micro Four Thirds is actually easier because with MFT, not NFT, Micro Four Thirds, the same thing applies, but you have a crop factor of 2. With MFT cameras, the crop factor being 2, if you took a photo with a 24 millimeter lens on your full frame camera, you divide that by 2. So to get the same composition on a Micro Four Thirds camera, you would need a 12 millimeter lens. 24 divided by 2, 12. Okay? If you're still with me, I am going to give you a bit of an applause, because that was a lot of information that I just threw at you, and I am sure you are confused if you haven't heard about this stuff before. So watch the video back a few times, test it out with your camera, and try different things. But if this video did help you out at all, make sure to that like button down below and leave a comment telling me that this helped you out, or just say hi. You know, engagement stuff. And hey, if you really think I deserve it, give me a subscription and we'll be getting closer to that 1,000 by the day. And also let me know if you'd want more photography explanations like this one. So how did I do? Was it any clearer than the other guys, or was it more confusing? I did try to get some B-roll to have some examples of everything, but you know, I'm in a limited situation right now. Alright, play around with your camera and test everything. That is my TLDR of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next week. Okay? Bye.